The morning it all ended began the way every Sunday morning had begun for the past 51 years. Bevelyn Harwick woke before the alarm. She always did. Her body had learned the rhythm of farm life so deeply that no clock could match it. She lay still for a moment in the gray Kansas dawn, listening to the wind move through the cottonwood trees outside the window. That sound had been the first thing she heard every morning of her life since she was 7 years old. It sounded like breathing, like something large and patient waiting outside. She reached to the right side of the bed without thinking. The sheets were cool. They had been cool for 4 years now, but the hand still reached. Bevelyn sat up slowly, swung her feet to the floor, and pressed her palms flat against her thighs, the way she always did when the body needed a moment to remember what it was supposed to do. The room was quiet in the particular way that rooms become quiet when someone has been removed from them. Not empty, just quieter than it should be. On the nightstand next to the glass of water she had not touched sat a small brass pin shaped like a locomotive. It was no longer than her thumb worn smooth along the engine's roof where a century of hands had touched it. She picked it up without looking at it. Her fingers knew its weight the way they knew the weight of a coffee cup. She closed her hand around it and carried it with her out of the bedroom. The kitchen was the warmest room in the house. It always had been. She turned on the burner, filled the kettle, and stood at the window, watching the morning come in over the eastern field. The wheat was doing well this year. Irwin would have said something about that. He would have pressed his coffee cup against his cheek and looked out that window and said something quiet and satisfied about the color of the crop in early light. She poured 2 cups, set them both on the table, looked at the second one for a long moment before sitting down with her own. This is not a story about grief, though. Grief is everywhere in it. It is a story about what happens when someone who has been made small by loss discovers that she was never as small as she believed. It is a story about a building that stood empty for 60 years, waiting for one specific woman to come through its doors. And it is a story about the things people hide inside walls when they are afraid, but not afraid enough to destroy what matters. But to understand why Bevelyn Harwick spent $450 on an abandoned train station on a cold Tuesday in March, you need to understand who she was and who built her. And that story does not begin with Bev. It begins with a man named Ambrose in 1887 with a pile of red granite and a set of hands that had never learned the word impossible. Ambrose Harwick came to Harwick Junction, Kansas with 4 things: a horse, a surveying chain, a leather satchel of borrowed money, and a conviction that the land beneath his boots was worth keeping. He was 27 years old. He had walked most of the way from Missouri. He had heard about the rail expansion and understood before most people that the railroad did not just carry passengers. It carried futures. Towns that the rail lines passed through became something. Towns that the rail lines bypassed became fields. The land near what would become Harwick Junction was good land, flat and wide and open to the sky in a way that made you feel both very small and very free. Ambrose staked his claim. He filed his homestead. He broke ground with his own hands and began to build. The station took 11 years to complete the way he wanted it completed. He did not build it small. Ambrose Harwick had a quality that architects call proportion, since the instinctive understanding of how big something needs to be taken seriously. He quarried the red granite from a deposit on the back of his own land, half a mile south of where the tracks would run. He hauled it by wagon. He cut it by hand. He laid each stone himself or directed the laying of it with the precision of a man who understood that what he built here would outlast him. The station rose to 3 stories. The front face was 40 feet wide, with a row of arched windows on the second floor, each framed in pale limestone, that made them look like eyes in a red face. At the center of the roofline, Ambrose built a clock tower. The clock face was 4 feet across, the numerals cast in bronze, the hands driven by a pendulum mechanism housed in a cedar cabinet on the 3rd floor. He wound it himself every Monday morning for 36 years. The inside of the station was something people came from neighboring counties to see. The main hall had a vaulted ceiling that rose 15 feet with plaster arches that Ambrose had hired a craftsman from Kansas City to detail. The floors were black and white marble in a running bond pattern. The ticket counter was a single slab of white limestone 12 feet long with a brass rail along the front. Along the east wall, Ambrose installed a row of oak benches with cast iron armrests, each bench wide enough for 3 people with enough room beneath them for the luggage a family might carry when they were moving somewhere new. And people did move. Through Harwick Junction, they moved west and north and sometimes east toward things they hoped for or away from things they feared. The station saw all of it. New brides in their traveling clothes. Old men coming home after wars that had not been officially declared. Children pressed against the windows of arriving trains, their faces white with exhaustion and wonder. Families carrying everything they owned in trunks and hat boxes and paper parcels tied with kitchen twine. Ambrose watched them all from behind his ticket counter, a short man with a wide chest and thick forearms and a habit of straightening his lapels when he was thinking. He wore the brass locomotive pin every day of his working life. It had been a gift from the railroad company when the station opened in 1887, a small token to mark the occasion. To Ambrose, it became something else. It became the thing he touched when he needed to remember what he had built and why he had built it. He ran the station well. He kept honest accounts. He treated every traveler with the same careful courtesy regardless of how much they spent or how they were dressed. He believed that a person in transit was a person at their most vulnerable, caught between what they were leaving and what they had not yet arrived at, and that such a person deserved decency. In 1923, the railroad company made him an offer he could not refuse, not entirely. The expansion of the national rail system required standardization of ownership. Independent station operators across the Midwest were being bought out or absorbed. Ambrose negotiated for 6 months before he signed. He extracted terms that his attorney tried to discourage him from, including terms the railroad company's representative read only once and then filed without much consideration. One of those terms was a buyback clause that extended 100 years. Another was a reservation of mineral rights beneath a defined boundary of land surrounding the station. A third established an easement guaranteeing the original Harwick family access to and usage of a 50-foot corridor around the building's perimeter to be inherited by direct descendants. The railroad company's man said these terms were unusual. Ambrose said that unusual things tend to survive ordinary ones. He signed the contract and took home his compensation and bought the farm on the north side of the tracks and spent the rest of his life raising cattle and watching the trains come and go from a distance. He gave the brass pin to his son Clifton in 1929, the year the world began its long fall into the Depression, with 2 instructions: keep it and give it to your eldest child. Clifton kept it through the Dust Bowl years when the sky turned the color of rust and the land dried to powder, and families packed up everything and drove west on roads that seemed to go nowhere and everywhere at once. He did not leave. He mortgaged the farm to the county bank and paid every cent back over 11 years and never missed a payment by more than a week. He passed the pin to Harold in 1944, the morning Harold left for the Pacific. Harold came home from the war in 1946. He was 21 years old and quieter than he had been when he left, but not broken. He worked the farm. He married a woman named Frances Dowd, who had red hair and a laugh like a handsaw and absolutely no patience for self-pity. Together they built something good on the Harwick land, something steady in particular and worth passing on. Bevelyn was born in 1946, the year Harold came home. She was the eldest. She received the pin the year she married Irwin in 1969. Harold pressed it into her palm at the reception and said nothing except that it was hers now. She had sewn it to the collar of every good coat she had owned since then. When she wore it, she touched it the way her great-grandfather had touched it automatically, the way you touch something that reminds you of who you come from. She was touching it now, sitting at her kitchen table on a Sunday morning, listening to the cottonwood trees, drinking her coffee, while Irwin's cup went cold across the table. The last several years of a good marriage leave a particular kind of silence when they end. Not the silence of a house that was never full. That kind is easy to describe, the emptiness that has always been there, the echo of a life lived alone. The silence that follows a long marriage is different. It is a silence that knows what it is missing. Every room holds the shape of someone who is no longer in it. Every habit carries the ghost of a shared habit. The coffee pot still makes two cups because it learned to make two cups years before the person asking it to stop. Erwin Harwick had been a quiet man, a methodical man. He had repaired every piece of equipment on the farm with the deliberate patience of someone who believed that things, if treated correctly, could last indefinitely. He had loved Bevelin in the way that some people love without announcement, without performance, through 50 years of small, consistent actions that together added up to something large enough to fill every room of a farmhouse and still have something left over. He died in 2020 in the spring when the world was already strange and frightened. The hospital was managing too many things at once to manage one more, and so he came home in his last weeks and died in the bedroom where he had slept for 44 years with Bevelin sitting in the chair beside him, and the window open to let in the sound of the wind. She buried him in the Harwick family section of Bethel Lutheran Cemetery, 4 miles down the county road. She stood at the grave without crying because she had already cried for 6 months and there was nothing left to cry. She drove herself home and made dinner and sat at the table and was very still for a long time. In the years that followed, Clive came more often. That should have been a comfort. Clive was 50 now, then 51, then 52. He managed a supply chain company in Wichita and drove a truck that was too large for the county roads and wore clothes that didn't belong to the part of Kansas he had grown up in. He and his wife Renata had moved to Wichita 18 years ago. The children were grown. The grandchildren were photographs on a refrigerator Bev had never seen in person. The supply chain business had been difficult since 2022. He did not say this directly, but Bev knew the signs. The truck that was too large for a man doing well. The way Renata stopped coming on the farm visits. The particular quality of his silences when money should have been mentioned and was not. She had seen enough of life to know that silence about money was rarely the silence of abundance. That autumn, Bev had cataract surgery on her left eye. She recovered well enough, but the weeks after were slower than she had expected. The medication made her tired in a way that was different from ordinary tiredness, and she found herself less inclined to read carefully, less inclined to push back on things that under other circumstances she would have examined more closely. She noticed this about herself and filed it in the way people file observations about their own limitations, somewhere accessible but not displayed. He was not a cruel man. That is important. He was not the kind of person who set out to harm. He was the kind of person who looked at a problem and looked at a solution and moved in the direction of the solution without spending much time on the territory, in between the territory where consequences lived, where loyalty lived, where the reasons things mattered beyond their market value lived. He began asking about the farm paperwork in the summer after Irwin died. "Just keeping track," he said. "Just making sure everything is in order, Mom." He suggested she might want to think about her options. He used that word options the way salespeople use it, as if having options were a gift someone was offering rather than a pressure someone was applying. He brought a financial advisor to the house in the fall, a young man with a portfolio and clean shoes who talked about liquidity and estate planning and the benefits of simplifying one's holdings. Bev listened politely and offered him coffee and showed him out. She mentioned none of this to Petra. Petra was her granddaughter in the deepest sense, though technically she was the daughter of Bev's daughter Margot, who had died of an aneurysm at 44, leaving behind a husband who eventually remarried, and a daughter who eventually found her way back to Bev's kitchen table every Thanksgiving and most Christmases, and whenever the world got heavy enough that she needed somewhere to put it down for a while. Petra was 26. She worked at the Kansas City Star as a reporter general assignment mostly, but with a sharpening interest in land rights and property law that she had not yet recognized as the thing she was building toward. She was compact and precise and had a habit of writing notes on her forearm with a ballpoint pen when she didn't have paper. She called Bev every Sunday. On a Sunday in January, Clive arrived at the farm with a folder and a man Bev did not recognize. The man said he was an attorney handling estate matters. He set papers on the kitchen table and explained them with the careful speed of someone who has learned that speed is a useful tool in the presence of the elderly. He pointed to lines and said words like authorization and representation in medical provision. Clive said it was just a formality. He said the word twice. Bev looked at the papers for a long time. She thought about the financial advisor with the clean shoes. She thought about the word options. She picked up the pen. She signed on the line because she trusted her son, and because the papers were long and the attorney was patient, and because at 78, after 4 years of living alone on a farm with a cottonwood tree for company, it can become very easy to believe that someone else's judgment might be worth trusting. The document, as she would later learn, granted Clive authority over all property decisions on her behalf. She did not fully understand what she had signed for another 11 weeks. The morning Bevelyn Harwick came home from church and found the locks changed. The sky was exactly the color of pewter, low and flat, and holding its breath. She drove her truck up the county road the way she had driven it every Sunday after the 11 o'clock service at Bethel Lutheran, past the grain bins and the old billboard with the peeling seed corn advertisement and the stand of cottonwood trees that meant she was almost home. She pulled into the drive and sat for a moment before she saw it. The front door had a new handle. The brass knocker she had installed in 1988 was gone. In its place was a silver lever handle, shining and featureless, and exactly like the handles on office buildings in cities where no one knows anyone's name. She got out of the truck slowly. There was a white envelope taped to the door at eye level. On the porch, arranged with a consideration that made it worse, were two bags. Her good canvas duffel, the old Samsonite with the broken wheel that Irwin had always meant to fix, placed side by side with enough care to suggest that the placing of them had been thought about. Inside the larger bag, she would find her winter coats, her good shoes, her Bible, her reading glasses. Inside the smaller one, 3 days of clothing and her medications, and the photograph of Irwin she kept on the nightstand. And in a separate box, wrapped in one of her own dish towels, the brass locomotive pin. She stood on the porch for a moment holding the white envelope without opening it. She could feel the weight of it, the particular density of legal language, the way official letters seem heavier than their content warrants. She set it down on the porch rail. She sat in the wooden chair by the door. The chair she had sat in every evening for 40 years, watching the field go from gold to gray. She put her hands flat on her thighs. She looked at the wheat field, which was still doing well, still that particular shade of early spring green that Irwin would have had something quiet to say about. She sat there for 20 minutes. Then she opened the box with the pin in it. She took it out and held it in her palm. The bronze was warm from being inside the cloth. She pressed her thumb along the locomotive's roofline and thought about Ambrose. She thought about Clifton. She thought about Harold. She thought about the way her father had pressed this same object into her palm on the day she married Irwin and said only that it was hers now. She put the pin in her coat pocket. She picked up her phone and called Petra. When Petra answered after 2 rings, her voice had that particular alertness of someone who has been waiting for a call they hoped would not come. Bev said, "I need you to come to Kansas." Petra said, "I'm already packing." The drive from Kansas City to the Harwick farm was 3 hours and 40 minutes in good weather. Petra made it in 3 hours and 15 in weather that was not good, and arrived at the farm drive at 4 in the afternoon to find her grandmother sitting in her truck in the county road with the engine running and both canvas bags in the truck bed. She pulled up alongside. She did not say anything dramatic. She said, "Follow me." They drove in convoy to the Lutheran church because Petra knew the pastor would let them use the meeting room, and the meeting room had a table and coffee and somewhere to be that was not a county road in the pewter-colored cold. They sat across from each other with their coats still on while the coffee brewed. Bev told her about the attorney in January. She told it plainly without self-blame, though Petra could see the shame the story carried, the specific shame of having trusted in the wrong direction, which is nothing like the shame of an obvious mistake, but something quieter and more particular. Petra did not say, "I told you so," because she had not told her so. She had not known there was a so to tell. She took out her phone and opened a notepad and wrote 2 words on her forearm, first out of habit, power of attorney. Then she asked Bev to tell her everything from the beginning. She asked about the papers in January, the financial advisor with the clean shoes, the new handle on the door. She asked about Clive, and she asked about Renata, and she asked about the farm itself, the paperwork, the deed what Irwin had left, and what Clive had access to. She asked without rushing in the manner of someone who understands that the details of a situation are not decoration, but architecture. Then she said, "Is there anything else? Anything that doesn't fit?" Bev was quiet for a moment. She reached into her coat pocket and found the pin and turned it over once. Then she said, "There was something Irwin wrote." When? She explained. There had been a box of papers Irwin kept in the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet in the farm office, personal things. Letters from his father, a copy of Harold's service record, old photographs. After he died, Bev had gone through the box, but had not done more than set it aside. It was the kind of box you return to when you are ready, and she had not been ready. In the weeks after the January visit, she had gone back to the box. At the bottom, beneath a packet of letters, she had found a small envelope with her name on the front in Irwin's handwriting. She had not found it sooner because she had not been looking far enough down. Inside was a single piece of paper, folded once. Petra said, "What did it say?" Bev pulled the piece of paper from her other coat pocket and unfolded it on the table between them. Irwin's handwriting was precise and slightly right-leaning, the handwriting of someone who had spent time on paper and took it seriously. The note was short. It said, "Bev, if something ever happens to the farm, find the original Harwick contract, the one Ambrose signed in 1923 when he sold the station. My father told me Ambrose kept a copy separate from the one the railroad filed. He said it was longer. He said there were things in it the railroad company did not read carefully and that Ambrose knew it and kept quiet about it. I never had reason to go looking for it. But if you do start with the station, the old one, it is still there on the south side of the tracks. The building is still standing. Dad said the station never really stopped being ours. I don't know what he meant by that, but I think he meant you to find out." Petra read it twice, then she sat back and said nothing for a long moment. Bev said, "I did not know he had written it." Petra said he knew something was possible. They sat with that for a moment. The coffee maker finished its cycle. The sound of it was very ordinary and somehow exactly right. The county assessor's office opened at 8. They were there at 10 past. Petra had spent the night at the Bethel Lutheran Parsonage, where Pastor Gunderman and his wife had offered Bev the spare room without needing to be asked more than once. Bev had slept lightly, but had slept, which was something. She woke before dawn and sat at the window and watched the flat, dark land and thought about Ambrose and about contracts and about the ways that people protect what matters to them when they cannot protect it directly. The assessor's clerk was a young man named Dwayne, who was efficient and not unkind, and found what they needed within 20 minutes. The Harwick Junction Station property was listed as a tax-delinquent property. The owning entity, listed as Consolidated Heritage Holdings, LLC, had failed to pay county property taxes for 6 consecutive years. The property was scheduled for public tax auction on the 12th of March. The 12th of March was 11 days away. Petra wrote on her forearm. Bev looked at the county property record on the desk, the description of the building, 3-story granite commercial structure, with clock tower original construction, 1887. Last interior inspection, 1978. Current status, vacant and structurally unassessed. Granite, Bev thought. He quarried it from our own land. Petra asked the clerk for a copy of every document related to the property. He produced a stack without complaint. In the truck, Petra spread them across her lap while Bev drove. She found the ownership chain going back 40 years. Consolidated Heritage Holdings had acquired the property in 1998 from a regional holding company that had acquired it in 1979 from the Burlington Northern Railroad successor entity that had absorbed the original rail line that Ambrose had sold to in 1923. She found the 1923 transaction listed in summary, the transfer amount, the date, the recorded deed. She did not find a copy of the full contract. Bev said that's what Irwin meant, the copy Ambrose kept. Petra said if there are terms in the original contract that weren't in the recorded deed, Consolidated Holdings might not even know they exist. She turned a page, then turned it back. She said, Bev, look at this. The ownership tree of Consolidated Heritage Holdings, LLC, traced back through two intermediate entities to a parent company registered in Delaware. The parent company was listed as AGR Holdings, an agricultural land management corporation with operations in 6 Midwestern states. Bev waited. Petra turned to the farm paperwork she had pulled before they left the county office. The deed transfer filed in February showed the farm property sold under power of attorney to a buyer listed as Green Prairie Land Management, LLC. She turned that page over and found the corporate filing. Green Prairie Land Management, LLC, registered in Delaware. Parent entity AGR Holdings, the same company. The silence in the truck cab had a different quality than the silence of Bev's bedroom before dawn. That silence was the silence of something missing. This silence was the silence of something arriving. Bev drove and said nothing and let Petra work it through. Petra said Clive sold the farm to the same company that owns the station. Bev said, or the company arranged for Clive to sell the farm. Neither of them said the rest of it yet, but it was there between them, the shape of something large they could not quite see, something that had been arranged over months or possibly years before either of them had thought to look. The tax auction was held in the Harwick County Courthouse, in a room with fluorescent lighting and folding tables and a smell of old carpet that suggested the room had seen a great many difficult mornings. Bev had worn her good wool coat, the charcoal gray one with the collar she had sewn the locomotive pin to in the winter of 2003. The pin caught the fluorescent light and glinted once as she took her seat near the back. The room held perhaps 40 people, contractors, investors, a few men in the kind of dress casual clothing that meant real estate by trade. Two young women with tablets who kept looking at the door. An older man near the front in a canvas work jacket who turned out to be a salvage dealer interested in the courthouse annex building. Nobody was there for the station. Nobody except a man who arrived 8 minutes before the auction began and sat on the far left side of the room in a gray suit that was not from Kansas. He had a leather portfolio and a second phone and the contained, expensive stillness of someone who expected to be the only bidder on what he wanted. Bev recognized the portfolio. It was the same soft brown leather as the portfolio the financial advisor had carried into her kitchen in October. She looked at the man for a moment, then she looked forward. The auctioneer was a county employee named Gerald who had done this job for 19 years and had the practiced neutrality of someone who has learned not to guess what things are worth from who wants them. He moved through the list with competent speed. A parcel of farmland on the eastern edge of the county, an abandoned grain elevator, a defunct motel on Route 50 that went for $11,000 to the man with the canvas jacket who apparently dealt in more than salvage. Then Gerald read the property address, Harwick Junction Station, South Track Side, Harwick County, Kansas. A 3-story granite commercial building with clock tower. Original construction, 1887. Tax delinquency total including penalties, $4,812. Opening bid, $100. Bev raised her paddle. The room did not exactly laugh, but there was a particular quality of attention that moved through it, a turning of heads, the suppressed amusement of people who have decided in advance that an elderly woman raising a paddle for a collapsed building was a kind of comedy. The man in the gray suit did not look amused. He looked like someone who had arrived expecting to be the only bidder and found that something had gone slightly wrong. Gerald said, 100. Do we have 150 pound? The man in the gray suit raised his portfolio slightly, barely the gesture of someone who did not expect to have to try hard. Gerald said 150, 200. Bev raised her paddle. This continued for 9 more rounds. The numbers climbed in increments that felt in the fluorescent lit room with its old carpet smell almost absurd. 200, 250, 300. The man in the gray suit's movements grew incrementally less casual. At 350, his jaw had tightened. At 400, he turned and looked at Bev directly for the first time. She met his eyes. She did not look away. Gerald said 450. The man in the gray suit looked at Bev and then looked at his phone and then looked at Gerald and said, 425. Gerald said, we have 425. Do we have 450? Bev held up her paddle without changing her expression. The man in the gray suit's phone buzzed. He glanced at it. He typed something. He looked up. He shook his head once, a small controlled motion. Gerald said 450 going once, going twice. He looked at the room in the practiced way that means this is the last moment. Sold. $450 to the bidder in the charcoal coat. The man in the gray suit closed his portfolio. He sat still for a moment with the contained stillness becoming something else, something with more heat in it. Then he stood and left without making eye contact with anyone. Bev did not watch him go. She was looking at her paddle. She had just spent $450 on a building that had been built by her great-grandfather's hands, quarried from her family's own stone, and managed for 36 years by a man who wound its clock every Monday morning without ever missing a week. It felt like a correct amount. She touched the locomotive pin once. Then she stood. That same evening, a man named Warren Fisk came to the church parking lot where Petra's car was parked with the engine idling. He introduced himself as a regional acquisitions director for AGR Holdings. He was pleasant. He was specific. He said he represented the company that had been the primary interested party in the station property and that he understood there may have been some confusion about the bidding process. He said he was authorized to offer $40,000 for immediate transfer of the property. Petra, who had positioned herself between Fisk and Bev with the practiced ease of someone who has done exactly this kind of thing on doorsteps and in parking lots, asked him to clarify the terms. He clarified them. Cash immediate, no conditions, no contingencies. Bev looked past Petra at the man. He was in his 40s, fit with the particular quality of a person who has delivered this kind of offer many times and found that it works. She said, I appreciate your time. He waited. She said, the answer is no. He said he understood and gave her a business card and said his offer would remain available and that if she encountered any difficulties with the property, any structural issues, any regulatory requirements, he hoped she would feel free to reach out. The phrasing of this, the regulatory requirements, the structural issues, the feel free was not quite a threat and was not quite not a threat. Bev kept the card. She put it in her coat pocket next to the locomotive pin. 3 days later, a letter arrived at the church addressed to Bevelyn Harwick, property owner of record. It was from a structural engineering firm contracted by a party whose name Bev recognized, Consolidated Heritage Holdings, the former owner. The letter informed her that a petition for emergency structural assessment had been filed with the county, citing concerns about the safety of the building at the address. The county had 45 days to schedule an inspection. If the building was found to present a public safety risk, the new owner would be required to either remediate or surrender the property within 30 days of the finding. Petra read the letter twice. Then she looked at Bev and said, they filed this the day after you said no. Bev folded the letter. She said, then we have 45 days to make sure the building speaks for itself. That night she lay in the church spare room and looked at the ceiling and thought about Ambrose winding the clock. She thought about the word difficulties and the word requirements. She thought about the financial advisor with the clean shoes and the attorney who had used the word formality twice. She thought about Irwin's letter and the sentence she had read more times than she could count. The station never really stopped being ours. She did not know yet what the station held. She did not know about the contract copy, the mineral rights, the 40 pages of terms that a railroad company's representative had read once and filed without much consideration. She did not know about the contents of the clock tower, or the box sealed in wax, or the letters that Ambrose and Harold had left for whoever came back. She knew only that she had bought a building made of stone quarried from her own land, and that somewhere inside it a clock had stopped at a specific time, and that a man in a gray suit had arrived at an auction expecting to be the only bidder and had not been. And she knew that in the morning she would drive to the south side of the tracks with her granddaughter and open a door that had not been opened in a very long time. The next morning arrived with the particular clarity of a Kansas spring day that has decided to be serious. The sky was pale blue and hard-edged, the light sharp and without warmth, but honest in the way that cold light is honest. It showed everything. The road to the old station site was still unpaved. Petra drove her car and Bev sat in the passenger seat with her hands in her coat pockets and the locomotive pin between her fingers. They passed the grain elevators and the water tower and the crossing where the tracks still ran east-west, still maintained, still carrying freight through a town that no longer depended on them. Then Petra turned south and they saw it. Bev had not seen the station in nearly 40 years. She had driven past its direction sometimes, but never turned to look directly. Some things you avoid looking at not because they frighten you, but because you know the looking will change something in you and you are not sure you're ready. But she was ready now. The building stood at the end of a gravel track overgrown with thistle and volunteer wheat. The red granite was darker than she remembered, stained with decades of weather, but solid, every stone still seated against its neighbor. The arched windows on the second floor were intact, boarded from the inside with plywood, but the frames themselves were sound. The platform overhang along the south face had partially collapsed. Its wooden beams rotted through, but the iron supports beneath it held. The main structure was complete. The clock tower rose above the roofline with the patience of something that has been waiting and has no particular feelings about the waiting. The clock face was dark. The hands were visible from the road, the bronze numerals still legible. The hands had stopped at 7 minutes past 3. She got out of the car. The gate was a heavy iron frame tall enough that it had once allowed covered wagons to pass, and certainly allowed automobiles padlocked with a chain that was considerably more recent than the gate itself. Petra had the bolt cutters she had bought at the hardware store in the county seat the previous afternoon. The chain came apart easily. Bev pushed the gate open. It moved more smoothly than she expected, its hinge pins still sound. It swung wide, and the morning light moved through the opening and fell across the gravel track ahead of them. She walked through first. The air near the building smelled of dust and old limestone, and something else beneath that. Something green and mineral and deep, the smell of stone that has been keeping its own counsel for a very long time. The grass along the building's base was knee-high. She pushed through it and put her hand against the wall. The granite was cold. It was grained and rough and absolutely itself, without apology, without the particular anxiety of things that know they have become useless. It was a wall built to last, and it had lasted, and here it was. She said very quietly to no one in particular, or to Ambrose specifically, "I should have come sooner." The main entrance was a pair of oak doors set into a granite arch, the wood gray with age but the structure intact. The lock was a double-cylinder deadbolt of the kind used in the 1950s, heavy brass now tarnished to the color of old pennies. Petra's bolt cutters were too large for this, but Bev had thought of this too. From her other coat pocket, she produced the key. Norris Fenley, the county clerk who had processed the auction paperwork, had handed it to her after the sale without being asked. He was 69, a man who had worked in that office for 30 years and remembered what buildings were before they became line items on tax rolls. He had said only, "I've had this in the back of the middle drawer since 1991. I always thought somebody from the Harwick family would come for it eventually." The key fit. The lock turned. The doors opened inward with a sound that was not dramatic, not the groan of fiction, but the simple mechanical sound of something large being asked to move after a long rest. A breath of interior air came out, not foul, not damp, but ancient in the way that sealed rooms become ancient still, and concentrated, and holding exactly what was left in them when the door last closed. Bev stepped inside. The main hall was as she had been told, and nothing like she had imagined. The ceiling arched above them, its plaster intact except for one section near the east wall, where a water stain had spread and dried and spread again over decades. The light that came through the gaps in the boarded windows was slanted, in particular falling in long, bright sections across the floor that was dusty but present, the black and white marble still running its bond pattern beneath the gray. The oak benches stood in their rows. The cast iron armrests were rusted, but the wood had held. The ticket counter of white limestone ran its full 12 feet along the north wall, its brass rail green now with oxidation, but still mounted, still complete. On the east wall, still hanging the schedule board. The brass frame had darkened the paper within it long since disintegrated, but the frame itself was mounted level in exactly the place Ambrose had specified. And above, centered in the vaulted ceiling, the chandelier. It was wrought iron worked into a wheel shape with arms extending outward and electric sockets mounted at each arm tip, converted from gas at some point in the 1920s. The sockets were empty, but the structure was there hanging on its chain, absolutely still in the stale air, 20 pounds of worked iron that had been above the heads of every traveler who had ever waited in this hall for a train that would take them somewhere new. Bev stood in the center of the marble floor and turned slowly. She had spent 35 years as a librarian. She had spent those years in the company of things that held information, things that had been made to preserve and transmit. She understood in a way that is hard to articulate the difference between a building that has been emptied and a building that has been sealed. This building had been sealed. Whatever was in it, it was still in it. She reached into her pocket and held the locomotive pin. Outside, very faintly, the wind moved through the thistle and the volunteer wheat and made its patient sound against the old granite walls of a building that had been waiting in its particular way for the woman who had just walked through its door. The first thing Bev did inside the station was stand still. Not from hesitation, not from age. She stood still the way a person stands in a room where something important happened a long time ago before they arrived, and you can feel the residue of it without being able to name what it is. The main hall of Harwick Junction Station held that quality strongly. It was the quality of interrupted purpose, of things set down and not yet picked back up. Petra stood beside her for a moment, and then did what reporters do, which is move. She walked the perimeter of the hall with her phone raised, taking photographs without speaking, documenting the details that might matter later. The oak benches, the limestone counter, the iron chandelier suspended above them in the still air, the collapsed section of plaster near the east wall where water had come in through the roof over decades and eventually found its way to the ceiling. Bev walked to the ticket counter and placed both hands on the limestone surface. The stone was cool and smooth along the top edge where a century of hands had worn it, and rough and original along the sides where no hands had touched. She traced the boundary between the worn part and the unworn part with one finger. This was the line between what people had reached for and what they had not. She thought about the travelers, the families, the brides, the men coming home from the Pacific and from Korea. She thought about the children pressed against train windows. She thought about Ambrose behind this counter straightening his lapels, watching all of it pass through. Then she began to look at the building the way her father had taught her to look at anything constructed by human hands, not at what it was doing now, but at what it had been built to do and whether it could still do it. The floor was sound. She could feel it through her shoes, the marble dense and unmoving. The load-bearing walls were granite, 2 feet thick at the base, narrowing only slightly as they rose. The roof above the main hall had a visible sag in the northwest corner, but had not failed. The wooden interior partition walls were another matter. Several had warped or buckled where water had reached them, and 2 of the doors she tried refused to open without significant resistance. The building was not ruined. It was tired in the specific way that buildings become tired when they have been left alone too long with no one to notice what they need. The difference between tired and ruined in a granite building with sound foundations and an honest, original construction was labor and attention and time. She had 2 of those 3 things and access to the third. She propped open both main entrance doors with flat stones she found along the base of the building outside, letting the March light and the cold spring air move through the hall. Then she went back to Petra's car and retrieved the 2 bags she had packed before the auction cleaning supplies. A broom, a flashlight, work gloves, a thermos of coffee, and a canvas roll of basic hand tools that had been Irwin's and still smelled faintly of machine oil. She had packed these bags the night before the auction without telling Petra she was packing them. Petra had noticed and had not commented. This was one of the reasons they worked well together. They worked through the morning. Bev swept the main hall from the ticket counter to the entrance doors, moving decades of dust and grit and the small evidence of pigeons who had found their way in through a gap in the second-floor boarding. Petra cleared the interior window ledges and assessed each boarded opening, noting which ones could be unboarded from the inside and which would need exterior work. They did not speak much. The work organized itself and they organized themselves inside it. By mid-morning, the hall was different. Not clean, not restored, but legible. You could see what it had been because you could see what remained of it clearly now without the scrim of accumulated neglect. Norris Fenley arrived at 11. He came in a county vehicle which he had driven on his lunch break. He was 69 compact with the particular posture of a man who has spent his career behind a desk and has compensated for it with long walks in the evenings. He had worked at the county clerk's office for 31 years. He had overseen the transfer of more property than he could calculate, and in that process had developed an understanding of land in Harrah County that went beyond legal description into something more like memory. He stood in the doorway of the main hall and looked around with an expression that combined professional assessment with something more personal. He said, "Last time I was inside here was 1991. The county was considering condemning it. I argued against condemnation. I said the structure was sound and that somebody would eventually want it." He looked at Bev. He said, "I did not expect to be this right for this long." He had brought a file folder. Inside were photocopies of every document in the county records related to the Harwick Junction Station property going back to 1887. He had spent the previous afternoon assembling them, working through his lunch and past the end of his shift, and had left a note on his supervisor's desk explaining what he had done and why he had done it. The note had said simply, "A Harwick came back for the station. I am helping her understand what she has." Arlo Bigham arrived the next morning in a truck that was older than the Century and in considerably better condition than it had any right to be. He was 97 years old and moved with the particular deliberateness of someone who has made a private agreement with gravity. "I will not rush you if you do not rush me." He came from 3 miles north, a distance that in Harwick County registered as close. He had heard about the auction from Dottie Mace at the diner on Route 12, who had heard about it from Gerald, the county auctioneer, who told everyone he spoke to about the woman in the charcoal coat who had outbid the man in the gray suit. News of that kind moves efficiently in small Kansas counties. He climbed out of his truck, carrying a brown paper bag. He walked to the open main entrance with the measured pace of a man crossing ground he has crossed many times before. He stopped in the doorway and looked at the hall the way people look at things they remember before the looking begins. He said, "Last time I was inside here, I was 21 years old. Your father was with me." Bev looked up from the clipboard where she was making a structural notes list with Norris. She said, "My father brought you here," Arlo said. "Harold brought me here the winter after we both got back. 1947. We sat on those benches." He pointed to the third row from the front with the directness of someone whose memory has retained its geographic precision. "We sat there, and we didn't say much. I think he needed to see the building was still standing. I think we both needed that. Something that was still where it was supposed to be." He set the paper bag on the ticket counter. Inside were 4 ears of cornbread wrapped in wax paper still warm. He did not wait to be thanked. He put his hands in his jacket pockets and walked the perimeter of the hall, slowly reading it the way old men read things they knew before they were old, with the layered attention of someone seeing through the present into multiple pasts at once. Dottie Mace came at noon. She was 68, ran the diner on Route 12 that she had inherited from her mother and had been running for 24 years. She was a woman of extreme practical kindness, the kind that expresses itself not in sentiment, but in the consistent and reliable appearance of hot food at moments when hot food is what is needed. She brought a cast-iron pot of vegetable soup and a sleeve of crackers and set them on the ticket counter next to Arlo's cornbread without ceremony. She looked at the hall with the eye of someone who estimates how long things will take and whether the people doing them are going to eat properly. She said, "How long do you think this will take?" Bev said, "I don't know yet. There are rooms I haven't opened." Dottie said, "I'll come back Thursday." She left. This was how communities hold their people together. Not with speeches, with soup on Tuesday, in the promise of soup on Thursday, and the reliable presence of people who do not need the situation explained to them because they already understand what is required. The dispatch room was on the ground floor behind the main hall, accessed through a door that had swollen in its frame over the decades until Petra had to throw her shoulder against it twice before it gave. It was a smaller room designed for the station manager's operational use. A desk, two filing cabinets, a wall-mounted telephone bracket from which the telephone had long since been removed, and a single window overlooking the east side of the platform area. The desk was solid oak functional with three drawers on the right side. The drawers were unlocked and mostly empty. A dried-out ink bottle, a packet of forms from 1954 that the Kansas City Rail Division had sent out, and which had never been completed, a stub of pencil, and a glass paperweight shaped like a drop of water that cast small rainbows on the wall when the afternoon light hit it at the right angle. Against the east wall next to the filing cabinet, Bev found it. It was not obvious. It would have been invisible to anyone not looking specifically for things that did not belong, things that had been added rather than built in. The wall had a section of newer-looking plaster, not new as in recent, but new relative to the surrounding wall, newer by perhaps 30 or 40 years. The plaster had been applied smoothly, but the texture was slightly more refined than the original rough coat plaster of the main construction. Someone who was not accustomed to reading walls would not have noticed. Bev noticed. She put her knuckle against the different plaster and knocked once. Then she knocked on the surrounding original plaster. The sound was different. She called Petra. Together they worked at the newer plaster with the tools from Irwin's canvas roll, careful not to damage whatever was behind it. The plaster came away in sections. Behind it was a section of the original granite wall with a small iron door set into it, perhaps 12 inches by 12 inches, of the type used in the 19th century for secure storage. The door was hinged on the right side with a small brass hasp and padlock. The padlock was the same vintage as the door. It was heavy for its size and had oxidized nearly to black. Petra photographed it in position before they touched it. Then she used the bolt cutters. Inside the iron door was a space approximately the size of two shoeboxes side by side. The interior was lined with the same granite as the surrounding wall. It was dry. The small size of the opening and the quality of the door's seal had kept moisture out for what appeared to be many decades. On the floor of the small safe sat four objects. A canvas bag tied at the neck with a length of twine stiff with age. When Bev loosened the twine and looked inside, she found bills. Old currency, the large format notes of the early 20th century, some from the Federal Reserve series of the 1920s, some from the wartime issues of the 1940s. The bills were dry and intact. She did not count them then. Later, she and Petra would count them $2,840. A small flat box of the kind used for correspondence holding a collection of postage stamps mounted on archival paper. Petra, who had done a story on estate sales, recognized immediately that some were early American issues worth considerably more than their face value. A bundle of photographs held together with a rubber band that crumbled when touched. She eased the photographs apart carefully. They showed the station in its operational years. The platform crowded with travelers, the clock tower visible above the roofline, a group of men in railway uniforms arranged in front of the main entrance, and one photograph that Bev held for a longer time than the others. It showed a man and a woman standing inside the main hall near the ticket counter. The man was short and wide-chested with thick forearms and a way of standing that suggested he expected the ground to hold him. The woman stood beside him with her hand on his arm. They were not looking at the camera. They were looking at the hall. On the back of the photograph in pencil, Ambrose and Edna Harwick, Harwick Junction, 1919. Her great-great-grandparents. In this hall, at this counter, looking at what they had built. Bev held the photograph carefully and did not speak for a moment. The fourth object in the safe was a piece of folded paper, not aged in the same way as the currency or the photographs. The paper was from a later decade, the 1950s, perhaps a standard letter-size sheet. The fold was tight and deliberate. She unfolded it. The handwriting was not Ambrose's. She had seen enough of Ambrose's hand in the station records Norris had provided to recognize its character, a broad slanted script with heavy downstrokes. This writing was different, smaller, more controlled. The handwriting of someone who had learned to write with care in the years when care was taught. It said, "For the one who comes back. The money is for the roof and whatever else the building needs first. The stamps are for whoever needs them. The real record is behind the clock. You will know what that means when you are standing where I am standing." It was not signed. But Bev knew the handwriting. She had a box of letters at the bottom of her own filing cabinet. Letters her father had written to her mother during the years before they married, and during the 2 years he spent in the Pacific. She had read them once after her mother died, and had not had the heart to read them again. But the hand stayed in her memory the way certain things stay in memory, not perfectly recalled, but immediately recognizable on sight. She said very quietly, "My father left this." Petra looked up from the photograph she was documenting. Bev said Harold left this here. At some point before he sold the land in 1961, he came here and he left money and he left a note and he told whoever would come that the real record was behind the clock. She looked up at the ceiling and through the ceiling at the floors above and through those at the roof and above the roof line at the tower she could not see from here but knew was there. He had been here. He had stood in this room. He had looked at what his great-grandfather built and decided he could not protect it by staying and could not bear to abandon it without leaving something behind. So he had sealed up what he could and written what he could and trusted the building to do the rest. The building had done the rest. Petra drove to the county seat the next morning and spent 4 hours in the records office with Norris, who had taken a personal day to assist. He had pulled every filing associated with AGR Holdings and its predecessor entities that touched Harwick County, which turned out to be a more substantial collection than either of them had anticipated. He spread the documents across the conference table in the records office and worked through them in the systematic way of a man who has spent 31 years learning where information hides in official paperwork. He found it in the supplementary filings for a drilling and extraction survey permitted 18 months earlier. The survey company was listed as a geological services contractor. The permit application described the work as preliminary assessment of subsurface mineral content in a commercial district zone. The zone description included the block that contained the Harwick Junction Station. The results of the survey were not public record. The survey company had filed its completion notice with the county as required, but the actual findings were proprietary to the entity that had commissioned the work. The entity that had commissioned the work was listed as AGR Holdings. Norris sat back and looked at the completion notice for a long moment. Then he opened the corporate records Petra had printed the previous day and found what she had already found: the ownership chain connecting AGR Holdings to the entity that had held the station property for the past 26 years. He said they surveyed the ground under a building they already owned. Petra said they already knew the building had value. They wanted to know what kind. They looked at each other across the conference table. Norris said the survey was completed in September. The farm sale went through in February, 6 months later. Petra said Clive did not know what AGR knew when he signed. Norris said, "No, I don't believe he did." He was quiet for a moment. But someone made sure he was in a position where selling seemed like the sensible thing to do. Petra drove back to the station with 2 folders and a cold cup of coffee from the machine in the records office lobby. She found Bev on a ladder inside the main hall examining the condition of the chandelier chain, mounting with the same methodical attention she brought to everything structural. She called up, "Come down, I need to show you something." Bev descended the ladder without hurrying. She took the folders from Petra and read through the survey permit in the corporate filing chain. She read slowly as she read everything, giving each line time to settle before moving to the next. Then she said, they knew about the minerals before they approached Clive. Petra said, before any of it started. The financial advisor, the attorney in January, the power of attorney. Bev said, they built the whole thing backward. Start with the survey, find the value, then find the person who can deliver the land. She set the folders on the ticket counter. She stood still for a moment in the center of the hall. She said, my son did not plan this. Petra waited. She said he found himself in trouble and someone arrived with a solution, and the solution looked like help. She picked up the locomotive pin from the counter where she had set it while working and held it in her palm. She did not say anything else about Clive then. There were things to understand before there were things to say, and she was a person who had learned the difference. The tension arrived on the fourth morning in the form of a dark blue pickup truck. Bev saw it first. She was outside the station at 7 in the morning assessing the condition of the exterior granite on the north face when she saw the truck come slowly down the gravel road that ran along the south side of the tracks. It was moving at the speed of a vehicle whose driver is looking at something rather than going somewhere. It passed the station and continued for another quarter-mile, then turned around and came back. It slowed in front of the gate and stopped for perhaps 2 minutes. Then it drove away. It came back the following morning. Same truck, same slow pass, same stop at the gate. On the third morning, Petra was outside with her phone when it passed and captured the license plate. She sent it to a contact at the Star who ran plates for the investigative desk. The registration came back to a fleet vehicle belonging to a property services company based in Wichita. The property services company was a subsidiary of a holding group. The holding group was one of the intermediate entities between the station's former owner and AGR Holdings. Norris confirmed it by noon. He said, they are watching to see what you find. Bev said, or what I do when I find it. He said, or both. That afternoon, a car Bev did not recognize pulled into the station drive and parked. The man who got out was not Warren Fisk. He was younger, dressed similarly, with the same quality of expensive patience that seemed to be a professional requirement at AGR Holdings. He introduced himself as a senior acquisitions coordinator and said that his company had become aware that the property had passed into private hands and wanted to ensure that the new owner understood the full scope of what she had taken on. He said the structural assessment would be expensive. He said the regulatory requirements for a commercial building of this classification in this zone were substantial. He said that his company had expertise in exactly these situations and had helped many property owners in similar circumstances find solutions that worked for everyone. He said that AGR Holdings was prepared to offer $120,000. Cash, no conditions. Bev listened to all of it. She stood in the entrance of the main hall with the march light behind her and listened without interrupting because she had spent 35 years as a librarian and had learned that you let people finish before you respond, and that the end of a speech often contains more information than the beginning. When he finished, she said, I appreciate the offer. He waited. She said, the answer is still no. He said he understood and gave her his card and said the offer remained open and that he hoped she would not hesitate to be in touch if the scope of the project became difficult to manage alone. She thanked him for coming. She put his card in her coat pocket beside Warren Fisk's card from 4 days earlier. Then she went inside and found Petra and said, they raised the offer to $120,000. Petra said they wouldn't raise the offer if there wasn't something here worth more than $120,000. Bev said yes. She looked at the ceiling, at the floor above, at the tower above that. She said, I think it's time to go up. The staircase to the upper floors was at the back of the main hall behind a door that had been padlocked from the outside with a chain through the door handle. The chain was heavy, but the padlock was small. A cheap replacement lock that did not belong to the building's original hardware installed at some point when someone wanted the upper floors inaccessible, but had not thought carefully about the quality of the obstacle. Petra dealt with it in under a minute. The staircase was oak, the same species as the benches, with a turned baluster rail that was cracked in 2 places, but still mounted. The treads were dusty and one had split along the grain, but the structural integrity of the stair was intact, the stringers solid beneath the worn oak surface. They went up slowly, not because the stair required it, but because the second floor required attention before the third. The second floor had been divided into 4 rooms during the station's operational years: 2 small offices for station administration, a waiting room for first-class passengers that had largely been stripped at some point, and a storeroom at the south end that still held 3 wooden crates of miscellaneous iron hardware: bolts, brackets, hinge components. The arched windows Bev had seen from the road lined the exterior wall of the former first-class waiting room, their frames sound and the plywood boarding keeping out weather. Though not light entirely, the filtered brightness giving the room a quality of late afternoon, even in the morning. On the third floor was one room. It ran the full footprint of the building, a clear-span space originally designed as a freight and baggage sorting area with iron tracks in the ceiling for block and tackle rigging to move heavy trunks. The tracks were still there. The rigging had been removed, but the iron track ran the full length of the room, 40 feet, a serious piece of infrastructure installed by someone who was building for the long term. In the center of the south wall of the third floor, a door opened into the clock tower. Petra looked at the door. She looked at Bev. She said, "I'll go." Bev said, "I know." She was not built for the tower stairs. She understood this without grief. The tower stairs were steep and narrow and rose 30 feet to the clock mechanism room, and her knees had told her clearly over the past 4 days what they would and would not manage. She was 78. She had learned in her 70s that accepting what your body requires is not defeat, but clarity. The same clarity that makes a good structure, knowing what load each element can carry without pretending otherwise. She said, "Take the flashlight, take your phone, photograph everything before you touch it." Petra took the flashlight. She pushed open the tower door. The stairs inside were iron, not wood. A spiral case bolted to the central stone column that supported the clock face above. The iron was solid. The handrail was cold and steady. Petra climbed. The first landing was at the level of the clock face. The mechanism room was small, perhaps 6 feet square, housing the cedar cabinet that Ambrose had built around the pendulum assembly. The cabinet was intact, the cedar aged to a warm gray, the brass fittings of the mechanism visible through the cabinet's small glass inspection panel. The pendulum was still. It had been still for 62 years, but it was there. The clock face on the south wall of the tower was internal glass 2 inches thick, set in a bronze frame. From inside the mechanism room, standing at the level of the movement, you were looking out through the back of the clock face at the outside world. The bronze hands were there, stopped at 3:07, visible from outside and from the road, and from anywhere you could see the tower's south face. Between the movement and the inner surface of the clock glass, there was a gap of perhaps 18 inches. The space of the mechanism housing designed for maintenance access. Petra swept the flashlight around this gap. On the left side, bolted to the internal wall of the tower between 2 structural iron braces, was a shelf. The shelf was not original construction. It was a simple plank of pine, perhaps 1 inch thick and 18 inches long, fixed with 2 iron brackets of the kind sold in hardware stores. The brackets were cleaner than the surrounding metal, less corroded, installed in a decade when the tower was already abandoned but not yet forgotten. On the shelf sat a tin box. It was the size of a large dictionary, sealed around the lid with red wax that had yellowed with age but held a continuous line of wax pressed into the seam between lid and body. A small paper label was affixed to the top of the box, protected by the tin roof and the shelter of the clock mechanism. The label had 3 words in the same controlled handwriting as the note in the dispatch room safe. For the Harwicks. Petra did not open the box. She photographed the shelf from every angle. She photographed the box from the front, both sides, the top, the label close enough to read the inscription clearly. She photographed the wax seal around the full perimeter. Then she photographed the view through the clock face, the familiar geometry of Harwick County below section roads and field lines running to the edge of visibility without deviation. Then she lifted the box carefully from the shelf. It was heavier than its size suggested. Not dramatically heavy, but heavy in the way of things that hold paper compressed, dense, the weight of preserved information. She carried it down the tower stairs, holding it in both hands, the flashlight braced under her arm, moving slowly on the iron spiral in the way of someone transporting something that cannot be replaced. She came through the third-floor room down the main stair into the main hall. Bev was standing at the ticket counter. She had laid out Irwin's canvas tool roll and Norris's document file and the folders from the county records and the photographs from the dispatch room safe arranged in the order in which they had been found because sequence itself is evidence. Petra set the tin box on the counter. They looked at it for a moment. The red wax seal, the paper label, the three words for the Harwicks. Norris arrived 30 minutes later. He had come after Petra's call, which had reached him in his car on the way back from his lunch break. He walked in and looked at the box on the counter without speaking. Then Bev said, "Let's wait until tomorrow morning. I want everyone here." Norris said Arlo. Bev said Arlo and Dottie. She covered the box carefully with a clean cloth she had brought in her supply bag. She set the locomotive pin on top of the cloth. Then she turned off the work light and walked to the entrance and looked out at the Kansas evening, coming in over the fields, the sky going from pale blue to the color of pewter, the cottonwood trees along the track line moving in the wind. Outside, somewhere down the gravel road, the dark blue pickup truck was parked with its engine off and its lights off and its driver sitting in the dark, watching the light go out in the old granite station. She watched it for a moment, then she went back inside and closed the doors. She had been waiting her whole life for what was in that box, even though she had not known it until 11 days ago. She could wait one more night. That is what the Harwicks had always known how to do. They knew how to wait for things that were worth waiting for. And the station, which had been waiting 62 years for a Harwick to come back and read what was behind the clock, waited one more night without any particular difficulty. It had practice. The morning came in the way mornings come, in late March, in Kansas, quietly without ceremony, the light arriving gradually from the east, as if testing whether it was welcome before committing to the full day. The sky above the flat land was pale and clear, the kind of sky that does not promise anything, but does not withhold anything either. Bev was at the station before the others. She had slept in the church spare room again, and woken before 4, and lain still until 5, and then given up on sleep the way a person gives up on sleep when the mind has already moved ahead to somewhere the body has not caught up to yet. She dressed in the dark, put on her wool coat, pinned the locomotive pin to the collar, and drove to the station in the county road quiet of pre-dawn. She let herself in with the key and stood for a while in the main hall with the work light on, looking at the objects on the ticket counter. The photographs from the dispatch room safe, Norris's file of county records, Irwin's letter, and at the center, covered by the clean cloth, the tin box from the clock tower. She thought about what Irwin had written. The station never really stopped being ours. She thought about her father, Harold, 36 years old in 1961, standing in the dispatch room where she had stood opening the small iron safe with hands that knew what they were leaving and why they could not stay to protect it directly. She thought about what it cost to leave something behind in a building and trust the building to hold it. She thought about what kind of faith that requires. Not faith in God, though Harold had that too. Faith in stone. Faith in the specific durability of things built with full intention by people who understood that they would not be there to see the outcome. The Harwicks had always built for longer than themselves. She heard Arlo's truck on the gravel road at 7:45. She heard Norris's county vehicle 3 minutes later. Dottie arrived with a basket that held a coffee thermos, a tin of biscuits wrapped in cloth, and 4 small jars of her own honey. Petra came last at 8:05 with a woman Bev had not met. The woman was Greta Sund. She was in her mid-40s, lean and composed, carrying a leather briefcase, and the particular expression of someone who has reviewed documents until late the previous night and found the documents worth reviewing. Petra had called her 3 days earlier. Greta handled property rights cases with a specific focus on historical land claims in the Midwest. She had taken Bev's situation on the drive from Wichita and read Norris's files on her phone and agreed before she reached the county line that what she was seeing was worth a full day of her time. They stood in the main hall together, 6 people in the space where hundreds had once waited beneath the iron chandelier that Bev had cleaned with a rag on a ladder 2 days prior, its arms emerging from the decades of grime into something closer to what they had once been. Bev said, "Let's open it." She did not use tools on the wax seal. She had decided during the night that the seal had held for 63 years and that breaking it carelessly would be a kind of carelessness the box did not deserve. She warmed the wax with the flat of her palm, pressing gently along the seam, moving slowly around the perimeter of the lid until the wax softened just enough. Then she eased a thin blade along the gap, and the lid came free without damage to the wax, which separated in one continuous piece, intact, the impression of the lid edge still visible in it. She lifted the lid. Inside the tin, resting on a layer of oilcloth that had kept moisture from the contents for more than 6 decades, were 4 items arranged with the careful order of someone who had thought about what order things should be found in. The first item was a single folded sheet of paper on top, meant to be read before anything else was handled. It was in Harold's handwriting, dated June 14th, 1961, 8 days before the county records showed the land sale finalized. Norris read it aloud because his voice was steadiest, and because reading aloud in a room with people who need to hear something together is an act that belongs to no single person. He read, "To whoever opens this box, I am writing this in the dispatch room of Harwick Junction Station, which my great-grandfather built, and which I have not been able to save. The debt against the land is more than I can carry, and the only way to keep the farm to the north is to release the land to the south. I have talked to lawyers, and I have talked to the county, and I have found no other way. But I want to be clear about what I am releasing and what I am not. I am releasing the surface land. I am not releasing what is beneath it, because that right was retained by Ambrose in the contract of 1923 and has never been transferred. I do not know if anyone will come back to claim it, but I know the station was built to last, and I know that the Harwick family tends to keep its word across generations. So I am putting the original contract in this box, and I am putting it where only someone who reads what I left in the dispatch room will think to look for it. If you are reading this, you read that note, you came back, you did the work. What is in this box is yours by right, by blood, and by the patience of people who built things that lasted. Use it well. Do not let them tell you it does not belong to you. Harold James Harwick, June 14th, 1961. The room was quiet when Norris finished. Arlo, who was sitting on the third oak bench from the front, put both hands on his knees and looked at the floor. Dottie set down the biscuit she had been holding. Petra was writing on her forearm without looking at what she was writing. Bev stood at the ticket counter with both palms flat on the limestone and breathed once slowly. Then she reached into the box. The second item was a document folded 3 times into a rectangle the size of a prayer book. The paper was heavy, the kind used in federal land offices in the 19th century, with a weight and texture that made it feel like it could survive another century without difficulty if treated with any reasonable care. The fold creases had darkened with age, but the paper had not brittled. She unfolded it on the limestone counter with Greta standing beside her. It was the homestead patent for the land encompassing what had become Harwick Junction Station and the surrounding property, issued by the General Land Office under the authority of the President of the United States, dated April 3rd, 1887. The language was the formal language of federal land grants, precise and absolute. At the bottom, the signature, Grover Cleveland, President. Greta looked at the document for a long time without speaking. She looked at the property description, the meets and bounds, the section and township and range numbers. She looked at the seal. She took photographs with her phone from 6 angles. Then she said very quietly, "The boundary description here is larger than the parcel recorded in the 1923 transfer, by roughly 40 acres on the western edge." Bev said he retained part of it even then. Greta said, "He retained the western 40 when he transferred the station in 1923, and the mineral rights reservation is listed on the patent as a perpetual condition of the original claim, which means it was never AGR's to have, regardless of what their contract says. She said this in the tone of a woman who has read many documents that claim things that are not true and has learned to state the correction clearly and without drama, because drama is not what the situation requires. What the situation requires is precision. The third item was a second document, this one on standard paper of the 1960s typed, rather than handwritten, with a notary seal affixed at the bottom. Harold's last will and testament executed in Harwick County on June 10, 1961, 4 days before the letter in the box. The relevant provision was in the third paragraph. Greta read it herself first, then passed the document to Petra. The provision stated that the mineral rights to the lands originally claimed by Ambrose Elias Harwick under the Homestead Act of 1862 and described in the patent of April 3, 1887, together with the perpetual easement rights established in the transfer agreement of 1923, were held in trust for the direct descendants of Harold James Harwick and were not transferable by any instrument that did not specifically reference and release them by name. No such instrument existed. No sale, transfer, or conveyance executed after 1961 had specifically referenced those rights by name. AGR Holdings had acquired the station property through a chain of title that had never acknowledged the Harwick Mineral Rights Reservation, because the 3 pages of the 1923 contract that established those rights had been separated from the recorded copy at some point in the intervening century. Separated or removed or simply overlooked by a railroad company attorney who had been in a hurry and had not read to the end. Greta set the document down. She said, "I need you to understand what this means in practical terms." Everyone in the room waited. She said the mineral rights beneath the original Harwick claim parcel, including the western 40 acres and the full station footprint, were never legally transferred. They belonged to Bev and have belonged to the Harwick family in unbroken succession since 1887. The geological survey that AGR conducted 18 months ago examined subsurface granite deposits across this area. Granite of the type and quality identified in that survey has substantial commercial extraction value. We are not talking about something speculative. We are talking about a documented resource. She paused. She said a GR did not approach Clive to acquire agricultural land. They needed control of the surface area above this resource. The farm sale and the station acquisition were 2 parts of the same strategy. They wanted both parcels so that no individual easement or access right could prevent extraction. Bev said, but they did not have the original contract. Greta said they did not have the original contract. What they had was the incomplete version recorded at the county, which did not include the mineral rights reservation. They built their entire acquisition strategy on a document that was missing 3 pages. The room was quiet again. Dottie poured coffee from the thermos without being asked. She passed cups around. This was the right thing to do, and she knew it. Arlo accepted his cup and held it in both hands and said nothing. He was 97 years old and had lived through enough reversals of fortune and justice to know that they exist in both directions, and that when one occurs in the right direction, the correct response is not triumph, but quiet. The fourth item in the box was 2 letters in separate envelopes. The envelopes were unsealed, the flaps tucked rather than glued, as if the writers had understood that whoever found them should be able to open them without ceremony. The first envelope had 1 word on the front station. Inside was a letter in a broad, heavy-handed script that Bev recognized from the station records and documents Norris had assembled. It was dated September 12, 1923, 3 days after the transfer agreement was signed. Norris read it. To the Harwick who finds this, I have signed a paper today that gives them the building. I want to be honest about what that cost me, because I think honesty is owed to whoever has to live with what I decided. This building took 11 years of my life to complete. I quarried the stone from our own land. I laid it with my own hands, or directed the laying of it myself. Every arch and every course and every timber in the roof above your head came from this ground and from this family. I gave the railroad company the right to operate the building and to call it theirs. I did not give them the ground beneath it because the ground beneath it is not a building. It cannot be transferred the way a building can be transferred. I kept that right in the contract in language they did not read carefully enough. I am not ashamed of this. I believe that what a family breaks from the earth stays connected to the family by a bond that no instrument can fully sever, and that someday someone will come back and understand what I left for them. I am giving them the station, but not what is beneath it. The stone that built this building came from our land. That is still true. It will still be true when the trains stop running, and it will be true long after that. Take care of the building if you can. It knows your name. It has always known your name. Ambrose Elias Harwick, September 12, 1923. Bev looked at the limestone counter beneath her palms. The stone that built this building came from our land. She pressed her hands flat against it and felt the cold solidity of it, the particular density of stone that has been in one place for a very long time and intends to remain. The second envelope had two words, for Bev. She opened it herself. The handwriting was her father's. She would have known it in the dark. She had read enough of his letters to her mother to know every particular of it. The precise sizing of the capitals, the way the E closed completely at the top, the slight rightward lean that was more pronounced when he was writing quickly. This letter was shorter than Ambrose's. Harold had never been a man who used more words than a thing required. It said, Bev, if you are the one who found this, then you are the one it was meant for. I always thought it might be you. You have your great-great-grandfather's habit of looking at how things are built, which is the same as understanding why they last. I could not keep the station. I have made my peace with that, but I could not leave it without leaving you the truth of what it is. The building is made of our stone. The ground under it keeps our name, whether the deed says so or not. I am selling the land, but not the right to it. That right belongs to any Harwick with the will to come back and read what I left in the walls. The pin will remind you who you are. Do not sell the pin. I love you. I am sorry I could not do more. Dad, Harold James Harwick, June 14, 1961. She read it once. Then she folded it carefully on its original creases and put it back in its envelope, and held the envelope in both hands for a moment. Then she set it down on the limestone counter beside the patent and the will and looked at what her family had given her. A piece of paper signed by a president, a will that had kept faith across 63 years. Two letters from men who understood that the things you build outlast the words you use to describe them. And a building made of stone quarried from the earth she was standing on. Petra called Greta's office that afternoon and spent 2 hours on the phone going through the documentation in sequence. Greta had left after the morning's opening with the tin box contents photographed in full and a clear set of next steps mapped on the yellow legal pad she kept in her briefcase. The power of attorney signed in January was challengeable on grounds of incapacity, Greta had said. Bev had been recovering from cataract surgery in that period. She had been taking medication that affected cognitive clarity. The attorney who had overseen the signing had not obtained a physician's clearance, which was not technically required but was in the circumstances the kind of procedural omission that a court would look at carefully. The farm sale executed under that power of attorney was therefore voidable. Not automatically void, but voidable, which meant that Bev had legal standing to seek its reversal. And the mineral rights claim, supported by the original patent and the 1961 will, in the complete 1923 contract now in their possession, was something Greta described as the clearest historical property rights case she had encountered in 11 years of practice. She said this without inflation. She said it the way she said everything, which was as close to precisely as language allowed. Norris spent the afternoon cross-referencing the 3 missing pages of the 1923 contract against the version AGR held on file. The pages had been separated at some point in the chain of custody between 1923 and the present. Whether they had been deliberately removed or simply misfiled in the course of one of the several acquisitions through which the property had passed, he could not determine. What he could determine and document was that they had been in the original contract as executed because the page numbering of the contract was sequential and the version without them skipped from page 12 to page 16 without any notation. Someone had known, or someone had not known and had been lucky. And then someone downstream had found out and had decided that the most expedient course was not to surface the discrepancy, but to acquire both parcels so that the discrepancy would never matter. That someone was AGR Holdings. Clive came on the fifth day. Bev saw him from inside the main hall. She was working near the ticket counter sorting the contents of the tin box into archival sleeves that Greta had sent with Petra from Wichita when she heard tires on the gravel. She looked through the gap in the boarded window beside the entrance and saw his truck. He sat in it for a minute before getting out. He did not stand at the fence the way he had before. He walked through the open gate and across the overgrown approach and stopped in the entrance of the main hall. He was 54 years old and looked in this moment younger than that, in the way people look younger when the performance they have been maintaining has been suspended. He was wearing a canvas jacket instead of the Wichita business casual he had worn every time he came to the farm in the past 3 years. His hands were in his pockets. He looked at the hall, the clean floor, the chandelier, the limestone counter, the arched windows with their light. Then he looked at his mother. He said, "Mom, I didn't know what they were after." Bev looked at him. She was sitting on one of the oak benches, the first row from the front, because she had been sitting down to do the sorting work. She did not stand. She let the hall be what it was, large and quiet and honest, the right kind of room for the kind of conversation that needed to happen. She said, "I know you didn't know." He waited for the rest of it. She said, "That's the part that hurts most, Clive. Not that you took the farm. You didn't take it. You signed a paper you shouldn't have signed. And you signed it because someone arrived with a solution when you were in trouble, and you trusted the solution more than you thought to ask me about the trouble." He looked at the floor. She said, "I'm not going to tell you that I'm not hurt. I am hurt. I will be hurt for a while, and that's honest, and I won't pretend otherwise. But I know my son. You are not a man who sets out to harm. You are a man who got into something he couldn't manage and made a decision that seemed to make the problem smaller and instead made everything larger." He said, "I'm sorry." She said, "I know." She did not stand. She did not cross the room. She let the apology be what it was, a beginning of something, not an end. There would be time for more of it. There would need to be time for more of it. Then the side door opened, and Petra came in with Greta soon behind her. Greta was carrying her briefcase and a folder and had the expression of someone who is prepared for a specific conversation and is ready to have it. Clive looked at Petra, then at Greta. Something moved across his face, not quite fear, not quite relief. Greta said, "Mr. Harwick, I'm Greta Sund. I'm representing your mother in connection with several property matters. I have some documents for you to review." She opened the folder on the limestone counter and laid out 3 pages. The voiding motion on the power of attorney, the formal claim of the Harwick mineral rights under the original patent, and a letter to AGR Holdings informing them that the mineral rights reservation in the 1923 contract had been identified, documented, and asserted, and that the geological survey results pertaining to the Harwick Junction property were now subject to a prior ownership claim. Clive looked at the documents without touching them. Greta said, "The farm sale is voidable. We will seek to reverse it. The power of attorney under which it was executed was obtained during a period when your mother was not in full cognitive clarity following cataract surgery. The attorney who prepared it did not obtain a physician's clearance. This is documented." She said it without accusation. It was a statement of facts, and facts stated clearly and in sequence are their own kind of force. She said AGR Holdings acquired the farm knowing that the station mineral rights were unresolved. They structured the acquisition to eliminate any obstacle to accessing those rights. When this is presented to the court, their conduct will be part of the record. Clive stood still for a long moment. The hall was quiet around him, the afternoon light coming in at its angle through the unboarded west window, the floor solid beneath his feet. the iron chandelier hanging above, absolutely still. He said, "What do you need from me?" Greta said. "Your testimony about the sequence of events, who approached you, when, what representations they made, what you understood yourself to be signing." He nodded once, then he looked at his mother. She was looking at him the way she had always looked at him, with the particular attentiveness of a parent who has decided that love and accountability are not in conflict. She did not look away. She did not soften it or harden it. She looked at him with the full, honest attention she had always given him. He looked at his mother for another moment. Then he picked up Greta's pen and pulled the first document toward him. He was there for 2 hours. He left without fanfare. At the door, he stopped once and looked back at the hall and said nothing. Then he was gone. 2 weeks passed. In those 2 weeks, the marble floor of the main hall was cleaned properly by Bev and Dottie, and two of Dottie's cousins, who came from across the county without being asked, and brought mops and were matter-of-fact about the whole thing. The boarding on the second floor windows was removed from the inside, and the frames were assessed for glazing repair. Wendell Pruitt, a contractor from the county seat who had done the roofing on the Lutheran church and came recommended by Pastor Gunderman, inspected the building and confirmed what Bev already understood: the granite structure was sound. The wood and plasterwork needed attention. The roof needed patching in 2 sections. None of it was catastrophic. None of it required the building to be anything other than what it was. The clock mechanism on the 3rd floor was assessed by a man named Vern Aldous, who repaired antique timepieces from a workshop behind his house on the south side of Harwick. He was 63 and had learned the trade from his father, and had never in his working life been presented with a movement of this age still in its original housing with most of its components intact. He spent 3 mornings in the clock tower and came down the second afternoon shaking his head in a way that meant something good. He said the pendulum was seized but not damaged. The gear train was dry but not corroded beyond treatment. The mainspring on the secondary winding had broken at some point in the past 60 years, which was why the clock had stopped, but the primary mechanism was intact and repairable. He said he could have it running within the week. Bev said, "Take your time, do it right." He said, "That's the only way I know." Greta filed the voiding motion on the power of attorney on a Tuesday. She filed the mineral rights claim on the same day. AGR Holdings received both documents by registered mail and by electronic service. Their legal team requested a 30-day extension to respond. Warren Fisk called Bev once. He was professional and measured and said that AGR Holdings was reviewing its position and that they hoped a mutually beneficial resolution could be found. He said the word resolution 3 times. Bev said, "I appreciate the call." She said, "The station was built by my great-great-grandfather. The stone came from our land. The mineral rights were retained in writing in 1923 and confirmed in writing in 1961. The documents are in order. I'm not interested in a resolution that involves me releasing what has always been mine." Fisk said he understood and would be in touch. He did not call again. Arlo came on a Thursday afternoon with a paper bag under his arm. He had been coming every few days since the beginning, bringing cornbread or a pot of something warm, walking the perimeter of the hall, sitting for a while, and then driving back to his place 3 miles north. He did not require conversation. He was 97 years old and had long since made his peace with the value of presence as its own form of communication. This afternoon, he did not put the bag on the counter right away. He set it on the floor beside the bench and sat down and was quiet for a while. Bev was at the counter organizing files. The afternoon light was coming in warm through the now open west window, and the hall had a golden quality to it in that light, the marble floor picking up the warmth and reflecting it upwards so that the room felt inhabited by something other than dust. He said, "I have something I should have given you sooner." She looked up. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and brought out a photograph. It was small printed on the heavy stock of mid-century photography with the slightly overexposed quality of a snapshot taken in good outdoor light. The edges were soft with handling. He held it out. She took it and looked at it. two women standing before the iron gate of the station. The gate was open in the photograph, the station visible behind them, the clock tower with its hands at some angle. She could not quite read at this distance. The women were standing close, their shoulders almost touching, turned at three-quarters angle so that both faces were visible. They were perhaps 40 years old, perhaps a little less. They were not dressed for a formal occasion. They were dressed the way women dressed in June 1958 for an ordinary summer afternoon. One of them had red hair. One of them had darker hair worn short. She knew her mother's posture before she saw the face clearly. The way Frances stood, the way she held her hands at her sides, slightly cupped, not closed as if she were ready to receive something or offer something. Bev had inherited this posture. She had photographs of herself in which she looked and did not recognize her own hands until she recognized her mother's. She turned the photograph over. On the back in faded pencil, Frances Harwick and Lillian Bigham, June, 1958. She looked at it for a long moment. She looked at the gate in the photograph, and then at the gate 40 feet away, open the same iron frame, the same hinges, the morning light coming through it, the same as it always had. She looked at the two women and thought about the summer of 1958 when she had been 12 years old, and the station had only recently closed, and the town was still adjusting to what it meant to be a place that trains passed through rather than stopped at. She said they knew each other. Arlo said, "They were friends for 30 years, from before I was born until your mother got sick." He said, "They used to come here on Friday evenings, after the station closed. They would stand outside the gate and watch the freight trains come through without stopping. Your mother said it was important to watch the trains even when they didn't stop for you. She said otherwise you might start to think the trains had stopped existing." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "Our mothers used to walk out here together every Friday evening until Frances got sick. I don't think I ever told your father that. I don't think he knew they came here." Bev held the photograph with both hands and looked at her mother's face. Frances Harwick, not yet 40 in June 1958, standing in front of her great-grandfather-in-law's station gate with her friend Lillian Bigham, watching the trains that didn't stop. She had known the station was Harwick. She had brought her daughter to the tracks once, sometime in the early 60s before Harold sold the land, and had said something about the building that Bev had not fully understood at 12 years old. She had said something about how buildings remember things even when people forget. Bev understood it now. She said, "Can I keep this?" Arlo said, "I brought it for you." She set it on the limestone counter beside the patent and the letters from Ambrose and Harold. Then she stood quietly for a moment in the hall her family had built, and the space her mother had loved, and the room where in a few days' time, the clock above her head would begin to move again after 62 years of stillness. Vern Aldis finished the clock mechanism on a Wednesday. He came down from the tower at 2 in the afternoon and said he was ready to wind it if they wanted to be present. Bev called Norris, who drove from the county office in his lunch break. She called Arlo, who arrived in his old truck in 18 minutes. Petra drove up from Kansas City and arrived just after 3. Dottie closed the diner early, which she had never done in 24 years, except for the deaths of 2 relatives in one ice storm, and arrived with a thermos and without explanation. They stood in the main hall, 6 people under the iron chandelier which caught the afternoon light through the newly unboarded west window and held it in the worked angles of its arms. Vern said, "The pendulum will take about 30 seconds to reach full swing. You'll hear it start." Then he went back up to the clock tower. They waited. The sound came first as a movement of air, the deep measured displacement of the pendulum, finding its arc, a rhythm that was not quite a sound, but more than a feeling, the kind of thing you perceive in the chest before the ears process it. Then the tick itself, deep and regular, coming down through the floor of the tower, and the ceiling of the hall, and into the room where 6 people were standing and not speaking. It was not a dramatic sound, it was a correct sound. The sound of something doing what it was built to do after a long time of not doing it without any particular fuss about the interval. The hands on the clock face moved. From outside, from the road, from anywhere you could see the south face of the tower, the bronze hands began to move away from 7 minutes past 3 and began the slow transit toward the correct time. Bev stood in the center of the hall and listened. She thought about Ambrose winding the clock every Monday morning for 36 years without missing a week. She thought about those Monday mornings, him standing in this hall, listening to the same sound and finding it correct. She thought about Harold sitting on the third bench from the front with Arlo in 1947, the winter after they both came home, needing to see something that was still where it was supposed to be. She thought about Irwin, about the letter at the bottom of the filing cabinet box, about the morning she had poured 2 cups and sat with one. She thought about Francis standing at the gate in June 1958, telling the world quietly that you have to keep watching the trains even when they don't stop for you. Arlo put out his hand. She took it. His hand was large and dry and warm, and had the particular steadiness of a hand that has been through everything it has been through and arrived at 97 still capable of steadiness. They stood like that for a moment. Two people whose families had known each other for 70 years, standing in a building that had known both of their families longer than that, listening to a clock that had found its way back to the correct time. Then she let go of his hand and walked to the ticket counter. She picked up the locomotive pin. She turned it once in her fingers the way she had turned it 1,000 times, feeling the smooth bronze of the engine's roof, the cast detail of the wheels, the solid, particular weight of something made to last. She pinned it to her coat collar. The morning Harwick Junction Station was officially designated a Harwick County Historic Landmark, began with sun. Full direct early April sun, the kind that arrives after the last of the March gray and makes the flat Kansas land look briefly like it is glad to be what it is. The light came in at a different angle than March warmer, now reaching the far corners of the hall that the winter sun had never touched, finding the limestone counter and the iron chandelier and the oak benches and making all of it present in a way it had not quite been before. Bev arrived before the others. She always arrived before the others. She stood in the center of the hall and looked at what had been done and what remained to do, and found that the ratio was for the first time satisfying in both directions. There was more ahead than behind yet, but what was behind was real, and what was ahead was possible. She walked to the first bench and straightened it, which it did not need, and then walked to the ticket counter and looked at the items arranged on it under archival sleeves. The patent, the will, the 2 letters, the photograph of Francis and Lillian at the gate, and beside them, in a small frame that Norris had brought last week without being asked, the photograph from the dispatch room safe of Ambrose and Edna Harwick in this hall in 1919, looking at what they had built. She looked at Ambrose in the photograph, short and wide-chested, his forearms on the counter, looking at the hall with the expression of a man who has done something he intended to do and knows it. He had built this building in 11 years with quarried stone from his own land, because he understood that what you build from the earth you come from is connected to you in a way that instruments cannot fully sever. He had signed a contract in 1923 and retained what mattered and trusted the stone to hold it. He had been right about the stone. Outside, she could hear cars arriving. She could hear voices, the particular register of a community gathering for something it considers worthwhile. She could hear children, which meant that people had brought their families, which was the right thing to bring to the opening of a building that had been built for everyone who needed to be somewhere between where they started and where they were going. She picked up the locomotive pin from the counter and pinned it to her coat collar. She walked to the entrance and pushed both doors open to the morning. She stood in the doorway and watched the people come in. They came the way people come into spaces that are larger than they expected and older than they expected and more themselves than they expected, slowly looking up, looking around the particular quiet of people encountering something that deserves attention. A family with 3 children, their feet loud on the marble, their voices going up into the vault of the ceiling and coming back changed by the height. An elderly man who had grown up in Harwick County and had not been inside the station since 1959 and stood in the entrance for a long moment before he could bring himself to cross the threshold. 2 women who had driven from the next county because they had read about it in the local paper and wanted to see for themselves. Norris arriving in his county vehicle and walking in with the expression of someone who has done something he is quietly satisfied with. Dottie with the thermos, and a smile that required no explanation. And Arlo last in his truck that was older than the century, parking carefully and climbing out with the measured deliberateness of a man who has made his peace with time. He walked through the gate and across the approach and in through the open doors and stood in the hall and looked at the chandelier and looked at the marble and looked at Bev. He said, "Your great-great-grandfather built a good room." She said, "He knew what he was doing." He said, "Most of them did that generation. They just didn't always get credit for it." She said, "They do today." Above them, audible through the ceiling and through the plaster arches, and through the carved stone of the tower that had been here since 1887, the clock kept its measured time. Deep and regular and unhurried, the sound of something doing what it was built to do. The hands moved at the correct speed in the correct direction above a county road in Kansas on an April morning, keeping time for everyone who had ever passed through, everyone who was passing through now, and everyone who would come after. Ambrose Harwick built this station with red granite he quarried from his own land in 1887. He wound its clock every Monday morning for 36 years and signed a contract that retained what mattered and trusted the stone to hold it. Harold Harwick sealed the truth inside its walls in 1961 with a letter that began with his daughter's name and ended with love. Irwin Harwick kept the thread of it alive in a note at the bottom of a filing cabinet box, written for a woman he trusted to find her way back. And at 78 years old, with $450 and a brass locomotive pin, Bevelyn Harwick walked through a door that had been holding its breath for 62 years and let the building finally exhale. It was the best $450 she ever spent.